For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on! Welcome back, guys. Tonight I'm reading to you Chapter 14, Mrs. Pransley. Bergen is a vast, colorful city on the western coast of Norway. It lies right on the water, where ships come and go from its many ports and harbors. The vibrant homes and bright-colored buildings rose with the earth up the rolling hills that were all rich with birch and powdered in snow. Bergen was a fairly populated city. Most families lived close to the harbor because the heads of the families typically worked for the ports, as trade from the neighboring countries was what the city was best known for. The townspeople were all kind, but everyone was slightly mundane. Bakers sold bread, butchers sold meat, and mothers shopped the markets while tending to their young, all while their husbands went to work loading and unloading crates from the docking ships, usually from sun up until sun down. Indeed, Bergen was a city where nothing exciting ever happened, and so the townspeople went about their uneventful day looking dull and uninspired. However, little did the sleepy town know that a cargo ship had just docked in one of its ports, and within one of the hefty crates being unloaded from the ship were 23 frightened young children who had been kidnapped from their home in New York City. That same crate was being craned off the ship and loaded onto the back of a horse-drawn cart. Then came an explosion from on the ship that sent a rumble throughout the city. The townspeople stepped out of their homes and went into the street, looking down into the harbor as a flash of white ignited from the ship's deck. The people covered their mouths and gasped. They immediately turned to each other and gossiped, and just like that, Bergen had found its excitement in a flash. Everything had happened so fast that Nick hadn't even the time to process it. The last thing he knew was that Emma had found a Cracker Barrel in Gilbert's satchel, and then she whispered something into it. They then disappeared in a flash of white. Next thing he knew, he was a dumpster, tucked away in an alley, picking a banana peel off of his head. Nick felt a tickle at his hip, and noticed Gilbert climbing out of his coat pocket, looking dazed. "How are you feeling, Gilbert?" Even his little squeak sounded exhausted. "Yeah, me too." He patted Gilbert's fuzzy head gently with his finger. He then realized they were down one. "Where's Emma?" "I'm over here." Nick waded through the trash, and hoisted himself out of the dumpster. He found Emma in the alley, emptying out the contents of Gilbert's satchel onto the floor, in which included Nick's snow globe, Mr. McTwizzle's old book, an extractable fork along with a few more of Gilbert's strange gadgets, and then half a dozen Cracker Barrels. "Hey, my snow globe!" Nick bent over to pick it up, then shook it. He smiled when he watched the snow swirling around the frosted village. "I was afraid of this." Nick fixed his gaze on Emma through the glass dome. "Afraid of what?" "The Cracker Barrels." She held them up, showcasing them all to him. They were now down to 6, but only one beamed with a golden glow. "They're all empty except for one." "Well," Nick put some thought into it, "can't we just fill them all up again?" Emma stood, and it was then that Nick noticed how tired she looked. Not to mention disheartened, which was a feeling Nick felt himself. "I don't know about you, but I'm not feeling rather joyful at the moment." "Me neither." Nick found a wall and backed into it, then whacked the back of his skull softly against it. "Emma, what are we going to do now? We're so close. The others were right there." His voice faltered. "Now they're gone." He slid down the wall until his butt hit the ground. For all we know, they could be halfway to the North Pole by now. Gilbert crawled out of Nick's pocket and scaled his shirt. He perched on his shoulder and then hugged his rosy cheek. Emma joined them on the ground. "We'll find them. I know we will." They sat there for a while, allowing defeat to creep in before Emma decided it was time to push it back out again. "Enough of this. We're not doing any good sitting around here feeling sorry for ourselves." She stood back up and gave Nick a hand to his feet. "What do you say we use the last Cracker Barrel to turn Gilbert back into a boy?" Gilbert jumped up and down on Nick's shoulder, throwing up his claws with a merrily squeak. "I gather Gilbert thinks it's a good idea." Nick stopped to think about it. He really didn't like the idea of using magic, but he also knew that Gilbert would remain a mouse, so long as they didn't. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no other way. Why not? He had wanted to sound confident about it, but he didn't. He plucked Gilbert off of his shoulder and gently placed him down on the ground. Emma offered the Cracker Barrel to Nick. "Would you care to do the honors?" "I'd rather not," he said with hesitance. "In that case, you might want to stand back." Nick went straight behind Emma, all while she rubbed the golden bell between her palms. "Are you ready?" she asked the little brown field mouse standing before her. He nodded. "All right then." She lifted the Cracker Bell to her lips and whispered, "Turn Gilbert back into a boy." The Cracker Bell clicked and clanked, like little machinery were at work inside of it. It then shot out of Emma's hand and flew right into Gilbert, leaving him clinging to the bell as it spun rapidly around in circles. It eventually rolled to a stop, and then it began to hiss like a deflating tire, all while a cloud of plum-colored smoke emitted from its cracks. The cloud engulfed Gilbert, and soon Nick and Emma could no longer see the little mouse within the thick purple haze. The smoke darkened and brightened, then brightened and darkened, all whilst crackling. Eventually, the smoke drifted away, and there was Gilbert perched on the Cracker Bell, coughing after ingesting all those magical fumes. But he was still a mouse. Emma went over to Gilbert and crouched. "I don't understand. What went wrong? I'm afraid it won't work like that." The children were startled to find that they weren't alone anymore. Someone had been watching them from the other side of the alley. It was a young woman in a lovely flower print dress. It was long and clung to her frame nicely, tumbling down to her buckled shoes. The woman had a lot of blonde hair, but it was held down and mostly concealed by a scarf that matched her dress. Cracker Bells only contain a drop of magic, but you'll need a heck of a lot more if you hope to change that mouse back into a boy. He's been cursed, and curses are tricky to revert. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" Emma asked. "A friend." The woman untied her scarf and revealed a pair of long, pointy ears extending out from her gorgeous blonde hair. "My name is Mrs. Pransley." Her ears wiggled. I was sent by a mutual friend of ours to come and find you here." The mouse and the two children shared a skeptical glance, and then they shifted back to the woman. "A mutual friend?" Nick pried, feeling suspicious. "The toy maker," she whispered, even though they were alone. "Come," she requested. "No point standing in the cold. My home is just up the street." She noticed their resistance and said, "I've just returned from my favorite bakery and would love to share." She had been carrying a wicker basket and enticed the children by showing them all the wonderful baked goods that were tucked inside. "Join me, won't you? I can assure you I'm only here to help." Nick began toward the young woman when Emma snatched him by the forearm and yanked him back. "Have you lost your mind? We can't trust her. We don't even know her." "Yes," Nick confessed, "but I'm very hungry and could honestly go for something sweet." He continued on toward the stranger when Gilbert popped out of his pocket. He climbed up Nick's shirt and onto his shoulder, where he waved for Emma to follow. "Oh, all right, but I'll have you know that if this is a trap, I'm holding you both solely responsible." Mrs. Pransley led the children out of the alley and into the streets of Bergen. They passed a market where many of the townspeople came and went, all of which greeted Mrs. Pransley with smiles and waves as she strolled along. They kept to their route, following a paved path snaking through the city. The path continued up a rolling hill where it broke off at the start of a forest on the outskirts of Bergen. Right up on the tree line was a quaint cottage 2 stories high, with smoke tumbling out of its crooked chimney. In the cottage's front yard were 2 young girls playing in the snow, each one wearing a scarf tied around their blonde heads. The girls laughed and giggled as they lay in the snow making angels. "Olivia, Faye," Mrs. Pransley called for the girls when she entered the snow-blanketed yard. "I'm back." "Mommy's home," said the youngest of the 2, "and she's brought friends with her," the other noted. The 2 girls skipped through the courtyard and up to the front porch, where the youngest one jumped into her mother's arms. The other one approached Emma. "You're awfully pretty," Olivia said while looking up at Emma. "Why, thank you." Emma lowered to her knees to brush the girl's blonde hair back behind her ear. That's when Emma realized her ears were long and pointy and hidden beneath the scarf. "I think you're quite pretty yourself." The girl blushed. "Do you really think so?" "I do," Emma smiled. Mrs. Pransley opened the front door, and everyone followed her inside. "Girls, I'll need you both to set the table for supper. The good china, please. We have guests." The young girl named Faye, pushing close to 5 years old, lifted a finger up to a cupboard and gave it a whirl. The cabinet swung open, and a stack of dishes floated out and arranged themselves perfectly around the table. "Faye, how many times must I tell you?" Mrs. Pransley knelt down and gently held her daughter by her wrists. "No magic. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama." Faye then went to join her sister and set the table in an ordinary fashion, which, by the way, took far more time than the girls had been able to do, if they had to do it the way they wanted. Sorry for the mess. Mrs. Pransley worked her way into the living room, collecting pieces of laundry, toys, and dirty dishes as she went. But I wasn't expecting company. That is, not until I received word from Mr. McTwizzle. But I didn't have the chance to tidy up with such short notice. Emma helped the girls set the table by folding napkins and placing them beside each of the dishes. That's perfectly all right. We would hate to be a bother any more than we already have. No bother at all, she assured. Nick took a look around the home. The furniture arranged throughout was all made from birch, the same type of tree that was planted through all of Bergen, and just as well as the ones growing in the forest that lay outside the cottage windows. Nick had never seen a home outside of the orphanage before. What the Pransleys had was simple and ordinary, but that's what he loved most about it. Your home is lovely, he said. You're too kind, but really it's a mess. Growing frustrated, Mrs. Pransley dropped her collection of laundry, toys, and dirty dishes right back onto the floor. She then lifted her fingers and snapped, and instantly the curtains drew shut. She then winked at the stone fireplace where weak embers lay dying, and instantly flames sprung to life, crackling. She then waved her hand like a conductor before a symphony. The whole cottage arranged itself on its own accord. Laundry folded, toys gathered back into a chest, and the dirty dishes were being scrubbed in the sink all on their very own. No fair, Mama. Faye stopped arranging the table to complain. You said no magic. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry. Emma found this to be curious. I'm sorry to interrupt, but why don't you want the girls using magic? Aren't you all elves? Faye giggled. Of course we're elves, silly. But elves aren't supposed to use magic when they're in hiding. Hiding from what? She cried. Why don't you all sit? Mrs. Pransley offered, gesturing to the table. We have a lot to discuss, and there's no point doing so on an empty stomach. Nick and Emma each took a seat at the round dining room table that was just like all the other furniture arranged throughout the home. It was cut and carved from the bark and wood of a birch. Olivia sat between Emma, and while Faye sat playing with Gilbert. The little mouse scurried up and down her shoulders, and it left the little elven girl with such a joyful giggle. Olivia thought Emma was beautiful, and hoped that she too would be just as pretty when she was older. Olivia even tried to sit like Emma, which was very proper, back straight, chin raised, touching her lips whenever she was in deep thought. Olivia also noticed that Emma smiled a lot more when Nick was close to her, and every time she smiled, she glowed. And then Olivia was left wondering what it was about boys that made girls smile. Mrs. Pransley fetched a fruitcake out of her wicker basket and brought it to the table. She divided it with a knife and then passed a slice to each of the children. Nick noticed that his slice of cake was speckled with colorful candied fruit. May I ask what kind of cake this is? He glazed his piece with a thin layer of butter, and because it was still warm, the butter melted right into the cake like a sponge. It looks rather good, he said while picking up his fork. Mrs. Pransley poured them all a cup of spiced tea. It's a traditional Norwegian Christmas cake. Jewel cake, said Emma while taking a bite. My mom used to sell them at her bakery every year for Christmas, though she did make them with raisins. She used her fork to poke at the candied fruit while Olivia picked up her own fork and mimicked her. I think these are cherries and pineapples. For a moment, Emma had forgotten that her mother was gone, and for that moment, while the sweet bread sat in her mouth, all was right in the world. But then she swallowed, and reality returned, and then she was reminded that her mother had passed. This will be my first Christmas without her, she realized. Nick reached across the table and took her hand. Christmas might look different this year, he smiled when he noticed Gilbert on a dish eating his way through a piece of cake. But when it comes, we'll have each other. Mrs. Pransley offered her condolences. I'm very sorry for your loss. Thank you, said Emma, and then she took another bite, all in the hopes of being reminded of her mother again. Silence fell while everyone at the table enjoyed their Norwegian Christmas cake. Nick was halfway through his cake when he decided to break the quiet. Mrs. Pransley, you mentioned that you and your family are in hiding. What are you hiding from? Humans, of course. She took a sip of tea and then explained. For 1,000 years now, elves and humans have lived separate lives. Somewhere many years ago, humans forgot about magic, and as well forgot about us. To humans, elves have become nothing more than folklore, and so we elves hide. We hide our magic, we hide ourselves, which has become a lot more tricky over the last 15 years. 15 years? Emma found this interesting. Why is that? Mrs. Pransley answered. That's when Lord Avelmark broke into CLAUS village. Both Nick and Emma got a piece of cake stuck in their throats before they managed to gulp it down. Most elves had no choice but to flee the village, myself included. And now many of us live scattered throughout the world, hiding amongst the human race. Our family, along with many other elven families, try to avoid using magic, all in the hopes of keeping ourselves hidden. Nick lowered his fork from his mouth to ask, "You lived in the North Pole?" "In CLAUS village, just like most elves," she nodded, while picking at her own piece of jewel cake. "This was long before the girls were born." She smiled when she glanced across the table and over to Olivia and Faye's innocent faces, both smeared with cake, crumbs, and butter. "I was only a teenager when it all happened." Nick felt himself pulled into the story, overcome with the need to know more. What exactly happened? It was the fall of Saint Nicholas, our most beloved leader of elven kind. She shared her story while her children ate, and they all quickly became engrossed in her tale. CLAUS village was once a happy place, and it was filled with such magic. You could literally feel it in the air and smell it in the breeze. You could even see its subtle shimmer in the sky. Saint Nicholas, a descendant of Saint Nikolai, was a kind and generous elf, with a round belly and a long, silver beard. She lightly giggled when she slipped into the past. "I remember a time when I was a little elven girl, running up the icy steps of the great hall where I slipped and scraped my knee. Oh, how I cried, when suddenly this giant of an elf appeared before me. He knelt down with the grandest smile I had ever seen, and washed my wound away with a wave of the northern staff. His wife was just as gracious, just as loving, and just as kind. They loved each other very much, and their love was felt by all of those who lived in CLAUS village." She snapped her fingers, earmuffs appearing on both of her children's heads. "No fair, I want to hear the rest," Olivia whined while pulling them off. "Not until you're older," Olivia pouted as she clamped the earmuffs back on her head. Once she did, Mrs. Pransley continued. "In one night, everything was ruined forever." "Avamork," Nate guessed. Mrs. Pransley nodded, her jaw growing heavier. "Lord Avamork represents a dark part of the elven society who believe that human children should not be protected from the monsters of the world, but to be instilled with fear." Something she said rang with Nick. "Monsters of the world? Do you mean Krampus?" "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she caught Nick and Emma by surprise. "Krampus was the first, yes, but not the only." Mrs. Pransley explained further. "There were many monsters who once roamed the world, not just one, and they all fed off of the fears of children. It began with Saint Nikolai and his battle against Krampus, ultimately leading to Krampus being forever entombed behind the gates of Twilight Bridge. Since then, the descendants of Saint Nikolai, rulers of CLAUS village, have all followed in his footsteps in protecting children by finding and fighting the monsters of the world." Emma checked on Olivia and Faye to make certain their earmuffs were securely fastened. She then turned to their mother. "Mrs. Pransley, are you saying that Krampus isn't the only monster locked in Twilight Bridge?" "The only monster?" she echoed, surprised. "Heavens, no. Twilight Bridge is the home to many monsters. That's why Lord Avamork broke into CLAUS village. He murdered Saint Nicholas and his wife to claim the northern staff for himself." Nick and Emma's blank expressions let her know that they weren't catching on fully. "Don't you see? The northern staff is the most powerful object in the world. It's because it can open the gates of Twilight Bridge." She made sure to stress her words. "That's what Lord Avamork is trying to do. He's trying to open the gates to unleash all of the monsters back into the world." "Holy moly!" Nick smacked himself in the forehead as he fell back onto his chair. "Is that all?" Emma fiddled with her fork, poking around at all the crumbs on her plate. "There's more," Mrs. Pransley pressed. Nick sat back up. "Oh good, I was hoping there was," he said with a sarcastic tone. She continued. "The northern staff is gifted with many enchantments, but one to be noted is that only an heir to Saint Nikolai may wield it." "But I thought Saint Nicholas was the last of his line," questioned Emma. "Saint Nicholas had a younger brother." Nick knew that Mrs. Pransley was about to say, before she even got the chance to say it, Lord Avamork is his younger brother, which makes him an heir of Saint Nikolai. This means if he finds the stone and unites it with the northern staff once again, Avamork will be able to open the gates of Twilight Bridge and release the horror from within. "I just don't understand," Nick began. "Why would Lord Avamork think I have the stone? How could I, an orphan from clear across the world, have the stone that powers the northern staff?" Mrs. Pransley took a sip of tea and answered. "I don't know, but I do know he thinks you have it, and he'll stop at nothing to get it from you." Nick's head felt ready to explode. "Just a week ago, I didn't even know elves existed. And I most certainly didn't know they fought monsters and protected children." He tried to piece it all together, but couldn't. "I'm not sure how I fit into all of this. But what I do know is that I need to get my family back. He held eyes with the elven woman, who, just like Mr. McTwizzle, seemed to know more than she let on. Mrs. Pransley, I don't have a magical stone, and I'm most certainly not special enough to be creating all of this fuss. I'm just an orphan from New York City, trying to bring the only family I've ever known back home. Her eyes were a window into her heart, and her heart was filled with sympathy. If you still hope to save your family, you're in for quite a long journey ahead of you. The children who you've come to rescue are already on board a train, heading now for Murmansk, Russia. There, they'll be put on a ship bound for the North Pole. There won't be another train heading in that direction until next month. No. Nick fell back into his chair again. Emma worried. God only knows that Avamork will do to orphans by then. There might be another way. Nick and Emma hung on the edge of their seats while Gilbert popped out of his piece of jewel cake, his round ears perked and twitching. There's a train departing tomorrow evening, but it's leaving from a station in Karlstad. Karlstad? Emma retrieved her map and spread it out across the table so that she, Nick, and Gilbert could view it better. But that's all the way in Sweden. It's nearly a day's journey by carriage. Well, you can leave first thing tomorrow morning. My husband will be happy to take you. He'll just be coming home from work. He's got the late shift down at the docks tonight. He already knows the situation and is willing to help in any way he can. Nick turned to Emma. Sweden? Are we really going to Sweden? I don't think we have another option, Mrs. Pransley suggested. Why don't you all head off to bed, get a good night's sleep? What about Gilbert? Nick scooped the mouse up from Emma's map, and Gilbert sat on his palms, nibbling on a small piece of cheese Faye had given him. Mrs. Pransley, can you please turn him back into a boy? I'm afraid I can't, she answered sadly. Your friend has been touched by fear magic. The only way to correct such magic is by the same way it was created. Only fear magic can alter itself. That, or with the northern staff, as the stone of the staff was created by both joy and fear magic. Nick and Gilbert's expressions both dropped. Oh, okay. Nick then mumbled under his breath with a hint of sarcasm. Another win for magic. Off to bed, Mrs. Pransley suggested again. Your journey begins at sunrise. She was gathering up the dishes when she spotted her children. Olivia, Faye, take off those ridiculous earmuffs and show our guests to their rooms. Alright, you guys, hope you enjoyed that chapter. Come back tomorrow night where we'll be reading to you chapter 15, A Dream Turned Dark.